The frost of December 1860 clung not just to the bare branches of New England maples and the humid air of Carolina pines, but to the very soul of the American Republic. A fragile peace, the frayed tapestry of compromises woven over decades by statesmen like Clay and Webster, had finally given way. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a man whose name did not even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states, was not a cause but a chilling accelerant to a fire long smoldering. The sectional tensions, rooted profoundly in the economic and moral schism over chattel slavery, had boiled over into an existential crisis. In Charleston, South Carolina, the air was electric, thick with a heady mix of defiance and celebration. The fire eaters, radical secessionists who had long advocated for a break with the Union, saw Lincoln's victory as the final unforgivable insult. Their rhetoric centered not on federal tariffs or states' rights broadly, but on one single non-negotiable principle: the permanent protection and expansion of their peculiar institution. To them, the Republican Party was a Northern abolitionist conspiracy designed to steal their property, human beings, and destroy their agrarian society, which was entirely reliant on the labor of enslaved Africans. On December 20th, 1860, the state convention passed the Ordinance of Secession, declaring South Carolina independent. It was a declaration of war cloaked in political formality. Up north, in the bustling markets of New York and the mills of Massachusetts, bewilderment mixed with outrage. Many Unionists, still believing in the power of the Constitution, scoffed at the action, dismissing the Southerners as hot-headed braggarts who would quickly return to the fold. Yet the gravity of the moment weighed heavy on those in power. President James Buchanan, his term dwindling, was paralyzed, a lame duck desperately searching for a middle path that simply did not exist. His cabinet was split, Northern members calling for firmness, Southern members quietly aiding the secessionists. Meanwhile, a young officer named Lieutenant Richard Hayes, stationed at a small federal outpost in the South, felt the tension personally. His mother's family were staunch abolitionists in Ohio, while his wife's cousin was already drilling with a newly formed militia company in Georgia. Every letter home, every newspaper, every hushed conversation among the troops was a reminder that the line between duty and family, between nation and state, was rapidly collapsing. He looked out from the ramparts and saw not the flag of the United States, but a question mark hanging over the American future. As South Carolina seized federal property, and its neighbors, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed suit in swift, terrifying succession, the fragile peace of the Republic completely unraveled, giving way to the inevitable, fateful countdown to open conflict. The low, gray light of the dawn of April 12, 1861, was shattered not by the rising sun, but by the roar of cannon fire. For weeks, the small, isolated federal garrison under Major Robert Anderson had held Fort Sumter, a brick fortress strategically dominating the entrance to Charleston Harbor. The fort was a defiant speck of blue in a sea of secessionist gray, a final tangible symbol of Union authority that the newly formed Confederate States of America could no longer tolerate. Confederate batteries, positioned on the mainland and surrounding islands, had been built up silently and meticulously. Now, under the command of Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, who had been Anderson's student at West Point, the ultimatum had been delivered: surrender or face bombardment. Anderson, with commerce, now echoed with the rhythmic tramp of marching feet, fueled by patriotic fervor. Men left behind bustling docks, smoky factories, and newspaper offices, eager to save the Republic in 90 days, a timeline that would soon prove tragically naive. 1,000 miles south, in the humid fields of Georgia, Josiah, barely 18, traded his mule's reins for a rifle called the Richmond. His conviction was fierce and local. He was fighting to defend his home, his way of life, and the sovereignty of his state against what he was told was an invading, oppressive force.
He had never met Abraham Lincoln, yet he despised the Yankee abolitionists who he believed sought to destroy the very foundations of his society. His fear was immediate and tangible. Fear that Northern soldiers would burn his family's modest cabin, and more abstractly, fear of the sweeping, irreversible change the defeat of the Confederacy would bring. The call was a whirlwind. Families were ripped apart overnight. In Iowa, fathers handed their sons into the ranks, offering stern blessings and worn Bibles. In Virginia, brothers stood on opposing sides of the fence, their shared memories now strained by incompatible allegiances. The uniform, whether blue or gray, became the ultimate identifier, replacing class, trade, and even family ties. For both Thomas and Josiah, the early days of camp life were a brutal shock. They learned to sleep on the ground, endure ill-cooked meals, and master the complex manual of arms. They were drilled relentlessly, the awkward civilians slowly being hammered into soldiers. Their initial enthusiasm, fueled by brass bands and cheering crowds, began to fade under the weight of aching feet and the stark reality of the drill sergeant's harsh commands. They learned that the muskets they carried were heavier than any plowshare, and the path they were taking was far longer and more perilous than the road from the city square or the walk to the family fields. They were citizen soldiers now, marching toward an unknown destiny, united only by the fact that they were soon to face each other in the terrifying crucible of battle. While the men marched and the cannon boomed, the true, unsung resilience of the war was found far behind the lines, within the homes and fields of a nation thrown into domestic upheaval. It was the world of the women, the enslaved people, and the remaining civilians who kept the world turning amidst the chaos. The war stripped away gender roles and social certainties, forcing radical and often dangerous adaptations on those left behind. In the North, Clara, a young mother in a small New England town, found herself running the family dry goods store. Her husband, George, had enlisted, leaving her with the books, the suppliers, and 2 small children. Suddenly, she was a proprietor, dealing with fluctuating prices, wartime shortages, and the gnawing anxiety that came with every casualty list posted at the town hall. She joined the newly formed Ladies' Aid Society, spending her evenings rolling bandages and scraping lint, her hands blistered, but her resolve hardened. The traditional boundaries of her life, home and hearth, had expanded into the public sphere, making her a vital economic and morale pillar of the Union effort. The transformation was even more profound in the South. On the vast plantations, the white women were suddenly thrust into roles of management they were ill prepared for, overseeing crops and, crucially, managing the large enslaved populations. The veneer of genteel Southern life rapidly peeled away, replaced by the grim realities of scarcity and mounting fear. For the enslaved people, the war was not just an external conflict.
Private Thomas, the young apprentice printer from Philadelphia, found himself running not from enemy fire, but from the sheer panic of his own comrades. His 90-day enlistment had promised glory. The reality was dust, exhaustion, and the sight of men he knew lying still in the tall grass. He discarded his heavy pack, keeping only his rifle, his mind numb to everything but the desperate need to put distance between himself and the terrifying sounds of the rebel yell. The easy conviction he had carried to war was replaced by a visceral understanding of death. For the South, it was a stunning victory that inflated their confidence, yet even they were too disorganized and exhausted to pursue the broken Union forces all the way to Washington. The lesson of Manassas was universal. The soldiers were amateurs, the generalship was clumsy, and the cost was horrific. The casualty lists, though small by later war standards, were unprecedented in American history, marking a shocking realization that this war would not be swift or painless. It would be long, bloody, and demand a level of sacrifice no one in the summer of 1861 had dared to imagine. The illusion of a quick victory was gone, replaced by the grim certainty of a protracted, devastating conflict.
While the Eastern Theater saw the massive, dramatic battles for the capitals near Washington and Richmond, the true strategic heart of the Union war effort lay in the West, centered on the mighty waterways. This was the domain of a man who looked ordinary but possessed an extraordinary tenacity, Ulysses S. Grant. His mission was clear: break the Confederacy's hold on the major rivers, the Tennessee, the Cumberland, and, most critically, the Mississippi, thereby splitting the rebel states and choking their economic and logistical lifelines. This would be a slow, grinding campaign, defined by endurance rather than brilliance. In February 1862, Grant struck the first decisive blow. Utilizing a joint Army-Navy strategy, he moved swiftly against two key Confederate forts in Tennessee. Fort Henry, situated on the Tennessee River, quickly fell to the Union gunboats led by Flag Officer Andrew Foote. 10 days later, Grant marched his army overland to Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. When the Confederate commander there asked for terms, Grant famously replied, "No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." The name Unconditional Surrender Grant stuck, and the capture of Donelson was monumental. It forced the Confederates to abandon Kentucky and most of Tennessee, opening the heartland of the South to Union penetration. Grant's success, however, was immediately followed by a near disaster. At Shiloh in April 1862, near the Tennessee-Mississippi border, his unsuspecting army was hit by a massive, surprise Confederate assault. The first day was a brutal rout. The Union line buckled, and thousands were killed or wounded. Grant, however, was unflappable. He refused to retreat, famously telling his subordinates, "We will attack at daylight and whip them." With reinforcements arriving overnight, Grant launched a powerful counterattack, pushing the Confederates back and securing a costly, bloody victory. Shiloh demonstrated Grant's resolve. He might be surprised, but he would not be defeated. The battle was a grim revelation of the sheer butcher's bill the war would exact. The campaign then stalled for a year as the North struggled to consolidate its gains and find a way to seize the ultimate prize in the West, Vicksburg, Mississippi. This fortress city, perched on high bluffs overlooking a bend in the Mississippi River, was the last
and millions like her a legal, moral, and military reason to risk everything and flee toward Union lines, crippling the Confederacy's labor force and swelling the ranks of the North. Lincoln's decree was revolutionary. It laid the groundwork for the 13th Amendment, redefined American liberty, and ensured that when the Union was ultimately preserved, it would be a new Union, founded on the principle that the promise of freedom was finally beginning to extend to all men. September 17, 1862, dawned foggy and cool over the rolling fields near Sharpsburg, Maryland. But by midday, the air would be thick with smoke, blood, and the terrifying screams of men. This day, known as the Battle of Antietam, or Sharpsburg in the South, would enter the annals as the single deadliest day in American history, a cataclysmic clash that lasted barely 12 hours. General Robert E. Lee had marched his Confederate Army of Northern Virginia into Maryland, hoping to gain supplies, sway the border state to the Southern cause, and perhaps secure European recognition. Facing him was the immense but cautious Union Army of the Potomac, newly energized under the command of General George B. McClellan. A stroke of incredible luck, the discovery of Lee's detailed battle plans wrapped around lost cigars gave McClellan the strategic advantage. Yet he hesitated, allowing Lee to consolidate his lines along Antietam Creek. The fighting commenced at first light in the North Woods and the infamous cornfield. Union forces charged into a stand of tall corn, only to be met by a murderous Confederate fire that shredded the stalks and the ranks of the advancing soldiers alike. The cornfield changed hands over half a dozen times, each struggle leaving rows of dead men lying amidst the ruined crops. Private Thomas, the city printer, now a hardened veteran, thought through the smoke here, the sheer noise of the cannonade and musket volleys drowning out all thought save for the need to reload and fire. He witnessed scenes of carnage that would haunt him for the rest of his life.
a terrifying intimacy with death unseen in previous battles. The battle then shifted to the center, focusing on a sunken road that became known simply as the Bloody Lane. Here, Confederate defenders dug in, turning the natural depression into a slaughter pen. Union forces, repeatedly charging the position, were mowed down until finally a flank attack broke the exhausted Southern line. The ditch ran red, and the ground was literally carpeted with the dead and dying. Finally, the fight moved to the lower end of the battlefield, where the battle hinged on a small stone bridge over the Antietam Creek. Union General Ambrose Burnside struggled for hours to take the crossing against a small Confederate force. When he finally succeeded, it looked as if he might break Lee's flank, but at the crucial moment, Confederate reinforcements arrived, preventing a complete disaster for Lee. When the sun set that evening, the ground was soaked. Over 23,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing, a casualty count surpassing the losses of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War combined. The battle was tactically indecisive, but strategically it was a pivotal, though costly, Union victory. Lee's invasion of the North was halted, forcing his retreat back into Virginia. Crucially, this success was the signal President Lincoln needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, forever changing the nature of the war. Antietam bought the Union the political and moral ground necessary to transform the fight for the nation's existence into a true fight for human freedom. For the Union, the summer of 1863 marked the Confederacy's most audacious and desperate strategic move. Following his stunning victory at Chancellorsville, General Robert E. Lee decided to risk everything on an invasion of the North. His goals were ambitious: seize a major northern city, disrupt the Union war effort, and, most importantly, force the Union to recognize the Confederacy. This invasion culminated in 3 brutal days in Pennsylvania near the town of Gettysburg, where the South made its ultimate, failing gamble. The conflict erupted unexpectedly on July 1, 1863. Confederate forces, searching for shoes, clashed with Union cavalry west of Gettysburg. What began as a skirmish quickly escalated into a full-scale battle as reinforcements rushed in. The Union forces, though initially pushed back through the town, managed to secure the high ground south of Gettysburg, a massive fish-hook-shaped defensive line anchored by Cemetery Hill and Little Round Top. July 2nd was the day of heavy, coordinated Confederate attacks against both flanks of the Union line. The fighting was savage and close quarters in places that would become instantly iconic and tragic: the Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and the Devil's Den. On the extreme left, a dramatic and desperate defense was mounted on Little Round Top by the 20th Maine Regiment. Running out of ammunition, their colonel, Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, ordered a bayonet charge down the hill, an act of sheer desperation that broke the Confederate assault and saved the Union flank. Had that flank fallen, the entire Union line would have collapsed. Meanwhile, on the Confederate side, Private Josiah, the farm boy from Georgia, felt the exhaustion and the growing sense of dread. Their brilliant commander, Lee, seemed overly confident, relying too much on the sheer fighting spirit of his men against an entrenched foe. Josiah's regiment was shattered by the end of the second day, having endured constant artillery fire and murderous musket volleys. The Union lines, though battered, held firm. July 3rd saw the culmination of Lee's gamble, a massive frontal assault against the Union center. Following the largest artillery barrage the continent had ever witnessed, some 12,500 Confederate troops, led by General George Pickett, marched across an open field toward the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. This was Pickett's charge, a magnificent but suicidal display of courage. Union forces, waiting patiently, ripped into the advancing Confederates with sustained and devastating fire. The Southern charge momentarily breached the Union line at a point known as the Angle, but the breach was quickly sealed. Within minutes, the charge was repulsed, the Confederate wave broken and beaten back. Over half of the men who charged were killed, wounded, or captured. Lee's dream of a decisive victory on Northern soil was shattered. The Army of Northern Virginia was defeated and forced to retreat, never again to seriously threaten the North. Gettysburg was the Confederacy's high tide, the moment when their maximum effort failed. Coupled with the fall of Vicksburg the following day, the defeat irrevocably shifted the momentum of the war, making Union victory inevitable, though still far from achieved. By the late summer of 1864, the Confederacy was reeling, but not yet broken. Its army still fought fiercely, and its deep interior remained untouched by the worst ravages of war. To end the conflict, a new, ruthless strategy was needed, a campaign designed not just to defeat armies, but to destroy the economic capacity and psychological desire of the enemy populace to continue the fight. This was the vision of General William Tecumseh Sherman, and his march to the sea became the controversial,
In the trenches outside Petersburg, Virginia, Private Thomas, the Union printer, felt the weight of time pressing down on him. It was 1864, and he was mired in a static, suffocating siege that defined the relentless grimness. The days were spent dodging sniper fire, the nights digging earthworks in the mud, and the constant fear was not of a grand, decisive charge, but of the mundane, random cruelty of a stray shell. His letters home were no longer filled with tales of adventure, but with requests for warmer socks and expressions of sheer, bone-deep exhaustion. The faces around him told the story of the war. They were no longer boys, but gaunt, bearded men whose youth had been scoured away by dysentery, bad rations, and the ever-present stench of the dead. Thomas's earlier conviction to save the Union remained, but it was now laced with a bitter disillusionment with the war's endless duration and the apparent indifference of some of his commanders to the staggering cost in human life. They no longer cheered new recruits, they pitied them. Across the thin line of earthworks, the reality was even starker for the Confederates. Private Josiah, the Georgia farm boy, was cold, hungry, and fighting in rags. The Confederacy's dwindling resources meant his rations were meager, often just a few ounces of bacon and cornmeal. The shoes on his feet were worn through, and the cold seeped into his bones. His unit had been cut to a fraction of its original strength, and every veteran knew the others by the scars, the coughs, and the shared trauma in their eyes. Josiah's conviction to defend his home was still present, but it was battered by the undeniable evidence of defeat creeping closer. The news of Vicksburg, the devastation of Sherman's march, and the endless stream of wounded passing through their lines. The earlier fire of secessionist fervor had been replaced by a simple, desperate resolve to endure. His primary goal was no longer to win the war, but simply to survive the next day, the next hour, and the next shell burst. For both Thomas and Josiah, the shared reality of the trenches transcended their opposing ideologies. They heard the same distant church bells, cursed the same miserable rain, and occasionally, during informal truces to gather the dead, traded tobacco for coffee across the narrow gap that separated their desperate worlds. They were survivors in a war that consumed men whole. This shared suffering, the hardening of resolve born of necessity, was the defining characteristic of the final, grinding years of the American Civil War, transforming the fight into a grim test of wills rather than a glorious battle of ideals. The spring of 1865 brought the final, desperate act of the 4-year war. General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, starved, exhausted, and vastly outnumbered, was making a last-ditch attempt to escape the relentless pursuit of Ulysses S. Grant's Union forces. The Confederate lines at Petersburg and Richmond had finally cracked, and the capital had fallen.
Lee's soldiers marched westward, hoping to link up with other Confederate forces, but their strength was failing with every agonizing mile. On April 9, 1865, near the tiny village of Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, the exhausted journey came to its inevitable, quiet end. Surrounded and cut off, Lee knew that to continue fighting would only mean the senseless slaughter of his remaining loyal men. It was a choice between preserving a doomed cause and preserving the lives of his soldiers. He chose the latter. The scene that followed was marked by a poignant, exhausted ending to 4 years of unimaginable conflict. At the humble parlor of Wilmer McLean's house, the two great opposing commanders met. Lee, resplendent in a clean, new uniform, met Grant, who was notoriously dressed in the mud-splattered blouse of a common private. The contrast was stark, yet their demeanor was one of mutual, respectful sorrow.
The freed people, or freedmen, immediately sought to establish the pillars of free life. They married legally, established churches, often the first truly independent institutions they controlled, and, most ambitiously, sought education. Elementary schools, often staffed by Northern teachers or established by the freed people themselves, sprang up across the South, demonstrating an extraordinary thirst for literacy. However, the political and social obstacles were enormous. The federal government established the Freedmen's Bureau to help manage the transition, providing food, health care, and establishing labor contracts. Yet the Bureau was understaffed, underfunded, and faced intense, violent opposition from white Southerners intent on maintaining control. The political challenge escalated tragically with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. His vision of a quick, lenient reunification was lost, replaced by an increasingly bitter conflict between President Andrew Johnson, who favored rapid, light reconstruction, and the radical Republicans in Congress, who demanded ironclad protections for the freedmen. The debate boiled down to the meaning of freedom. Was it simply the absence of chains, or did it include the fundamental rights of citizenship, including the right to vote and own land? The years immediately following the war were defined by this struggle. While Northern efforts secured the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, establishing the legal framework for freedom, the reality on the ground was a constant fight against violence, intimidation, and the newly established Black Codes, laws designed by Southern states to restrict the mobility and labor of Black citizens. The weight of Reconstruction was the painful realization that preserving the Union was merely the first, easier step. The real test was transforming a society built on racial subjugation into a true democracy, a challenge that would consume the nation for decades and whose failures would have long-lasting, tragic consequences. The guns had long fallen silent, the amendments had been ratified, and the Union was formally restored, yet the wounds of the Civil War were not scars that faded. They were indelible marks that continued to shape the American identity, politics, and conscience for generations to come. The conflict did not conclude at Appomattox. It merely transitioned into a long, often bitter psychological and political struggle over memory and meaning. The war fundamentally altered the American identity. Before 1861, the nation was generally referred to in the plural. The United States are. After 1865, the singular became dominant. The United States is. The war forged a new national consciousness, defining the Union as permanent and indivisible. However, it simultaneously entrenched a deep cultural fissure. In the North, the memory of the war became synonymous with freedom, progress, and the triumph of industrial democracy over agrarian aristocracy.